Hello and welcome to our on-demand webinar on peak season planning, sponsored by ProShip Inc. and Manhattan Associates. Our speakers today are Justin Kramer and Scott Scoff. Justin is the Global Project Management Director and co-founder of ProShip multi-carrier shipping software. He has deployed, designed, or consulted on over 300 customer shipping solutions within 4 continents and has designed shipping solutions executing more than 1.1 million labels a day. Justin has been on the IT side of shipping since 2001. Scott is Vice President of Customer Support for Manhattan's Distribution Management Solutions in the Americas. He leads global call center operations, post-implementation services, operations advisement teams, and customer success management. In addition, Scott leverages his 20 years at Manhattan to lend his advice to customers when they design their world-class production support processes for Manhattan Solutions. Lastly, Scott leads the peak season preparation and support program for Manhattan Associates. Justin and Scott will share their experiences, strategies, and insights as they relate to peak season preparation, both methodically and proactively. With that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Welcome everybody. I've certainly been looking forward to this webinar as the topic of peak season prep is near and dear to me, as I've been in the trenches with customers since holiday peak season became even more significant over the last decade as a result of e-commerce holiday demands. We've been able to move from more of a reactionary to a proactive approach and been able to begin developing a structured approach to increase our customer success. Justin, that said, the ever-changing demands in the market and the end customer behavior does mean that we got to keep evolving and building in the ability to satisfy new business demands quickly while mitigating the inherent risk associated with significantly changing our systems year over year. So our objectives today are one, share our structured peak season preparation process. 2, to share some tactical yet impactful best practices. Justin, did I miss anything?
Well, Scott, I would only add one thing, and really the fact that we want to be sharing what we've seen trending in the industry, in the field, amongst our ProShip and Manhattan customers, and how it relates to peak season prep. So really the third objective is share strategic industry trends with our audience.
Yeah, makes sense. Agreed. All right, so let's proceed. So you'll notice here the graphic showing the cyclical nature of peak season prep. So it is indeed a never-ending process of continuous improvement with the goal of staying just that one step ahead. And as for the agenda, I'll share these prep phases in a calendar form next, and then we'll move into the details of each phase and finally wrap it up with some key takeaways. So let's get into details. All right, allow me to quickly run through the typical peak season prep cycle by showing it to you in this calendar form. Now, I should acknowledge that there are different peak season calendars for different customers. Customers can have different or other peak seasons, such as spring peak season or back to school, special sales, or even around product launches. But the focus of this webinar is going to be on the traditional November, December holiday peak season. So typically we view the prep calendar, starting with the strategic planning session occurring in the first few months of the year, followed by execution and deployment of those initiatives that are chosen. And then, of course, the validation of those initiatives to make sure they yield the expected results and are resilient against the high order volumes. Now, note that the testing is typically occurring mid-year, such that one has time to react and resolve any findings before that readiness phase in September-October timeframe. So after readiness, we move into monitoring and support, which is the actual peak season activity. And then lastly, we have a post-peak follow-up phase that occurs in the January-February timeframe.
So Scott, question here. So does this calendar here, is this really for the Kohl's and the Targets? And is there shorter duration calendars that might apply to smaller retails?
Yeah, so based on my interactions, this calendar is pretty typical for all customers. Since, if you think about it, the size of the IT capacity typically scales with the size of the customer. So a smaller IT shop would need more time to get all those activities done. In fact, the other point around this is some of those smaller specialty retailers have a lot riding on their peak season. It can truly be a make or break. So the risk for them is significant, which means they're going to want to build more contingency into their plans and possibly elongate their planning periods. So while we do have some customers, though, that start that strategic phase in the June timeframe and aim to implement that, that new modification, that new configuration, mid Q3 time period, they do sacrifice that ability to perform a VPT, a volume performance test, and they've sacrificed the ability to truly bake in those changes well before peak, which actually kind of underscores the entire point of sharing this calendar. If you understand all these important phases, you can see why it's so important to start preparation early.
Yeah, these phases are really important, and so with that, let's dive right into them and actually look at the first phase of the year. After executing your monitoring support process throughout the peak season, hopefully you have had minimal issues and will be able to move forward and take the first steps of the year, and that is the post-peak follow-up. Now, don't confuse this with a strategic planning meeting. This is different. This is more like the ultimate post-mortem. It's the meeting before the meeting. It's really where you review what went right and what went wrong. Okay? You want to assess the successes and opportunities. You want to document the lessons learned. Hopefully you've been doing this throughout peak season already.
Yeah, and Justin, so our most prepared customers typically hold these peak season, these post-peak season assessments in that January, February timeframe. Now, we'll get into more of this later, but I can't stress enough the importance of detailed record keeping during peak season, such that you have the memory of all those successes and problems that occurred. But note that this is more of a quick post-mortem that we're talking about here. It's not the strategic planning session for the next peak.
Yeah, so if it's early in the year or late in peak for you, now is a great time to make sure you schedule this meeting. It's not too late, any time of the year, to make sure you got this in, so you got that post-mortem before you actually start the strategic planning meeting.
All right, moving on. So this is all about the strategic meeting to define the plans for the year. This is the best opportunity to take a deep dive, evaluate those lessons learned from last peak season, and merge them with the strategic initiatives that provide direction for the next peak season. So the typical participants are subject matter experts, any stakeholders, IT and operations leadership, and also key vendors such as Manhattan and ProShip.
So Scott, in your experience, is this a single meeting or a series of meetings, or is it company dependent?
I'd say it's definitely more company dependent. I see customers of ours incorporate some on-site operations reviews with this. It can be a great time to incorporate an annual visit from Manhattan Associates as operations advisors. The other thing is some companies are looking for input from others, such as us, for what's trending. So they want to bring us to the table along with other supply chain leaders.
Operations, IT, external vendors, starting to sound a lot like a participant list.
All right, so let's get into the gather phase.
And so gathering is going to be one of the largest topics, as there's so much information available to everyone right now. But we recommend you focus on what's most going to affect your business.
So these peak season initiatives, we could categorize them as transformational, corrective, optimization, capacity additions. Really, these initiatives decide whether you lead or follow in your industry into the next peak season. I'll start off with highlighting some of the transformational themes we see trending today, but we won't be diving into the details on these, but rather share the themes for you to explore further with your company if they're not already on the table for consideration yet. So first is that continued, we're seeing that the usual trends of customers focusing on their e-com and omni-channel strategies. So many of the needs related to those programs surface. A few examples here, like fulfillment from stores to increase their network capacity.
And it should be noted that we see more and more companies leveraging those internal inventory sources by adding their stores as part of their ship and execution process.
We also see improved network inventory availability and visibility to prevent those lost sales during peak season. Any programs related to customer experience, email, text notification, social media, coupon integration, marketplace integration, those are hot and trending areas for us. We can get as complex as designing and setting up boomerang thresholds, so the dynamic adjustment of retention periods for those unattended orders in stores are acted on, or as simple as system configuration to implement holiday-specific customer appeasement and coupon strategies. So the other area we're seeing is focus is around automation and robotics, a really hot area right now. Trends of increasing automation as labor costs rise. And those examples would be sortation, robotic picking, goods to person, auto bagging, carton builders, etc. But we have to acknowledge that as the dependency on this automation in the DC increases, so does the risk. And we recognize the need to potentially bypass the automation when it breaks down, especially during peak season, and have tested contingency plans in place. And you can even use those contingencies sometimes as extra capacity during peak season. The most obvious example of that is if you have some put walls, some basic put walls in the distribution center, and you're using that as a contingency in case your sorter breaks down. You can use them both during peak just for extra capacity. Also, leveraging shipping from stores. This is not just about getting closer to the customer and extra capacity and quicker delivery, but it's also a contingency for your DCs too. So this type of external contingency can be helpful when an entire DC is unavailable. Just think, we've had these winter storms recently, and if a whole DC is unavailable, how are you going to still get your deliveries to your customers? And as this dependency on automation increases and the investment increases, so does the focus on utilization of those assets. We at Manhattan, we're seeing some very strong interest in how our latest WMOS ties together order streaming, which is another name for waveless picking, and our warehouse execution system signals to just make sure we maximize the usage and leverage of those material handling investments.
Yeah, one of the things we've seen as a great material handling investment is a lot of our mutual customers are leveraging ProShip's offering of a packaging solution called the CVP, which helps to minimize dimensional weight charges while allowing warehouses to do more with their existing labor forces.
Yeah, so speaking of labor, so we're all probably feeling the impact of those labor shortages. I'm sure you all felt them during this last peak season. And even as you're trying to onboard those temp workers. Right, so we're seeing an acceleration of the demand or trends of wanting to simplify the functions utilized by that temporary labor. So, for example, the use of picking via mobile phone-like devices, anything that's easier to use, full screen touch UIs, anything around that. Justin, I'll let you comment on the next topic around the delivery and collection options.
Yeah, so this is one that is changing every year. And we're seeing it kind of on both ends of the scale. On the high touch end, we're seeing a lot of increase in crowdsourced delivery, which is one of the methods of executing same-day delivery processes. And of course, we're seeing same-day delivery processes increase with the carriers as well. On the other end, on the value end of the scale, we're seeing a lot more postal last mile services come into play in order to provide, especially with the increased number of origins that customers have now, we're seeing providing a lot more low-cost shipping to meet those free shipping opportunities. All
right, so lastly here, from an industry trends perspective, I'm seeing a renewed focus on returns, an efficient returns process. Right? And as you know, return season is typically right at the end of peak season, but the newer try it before you buy it trend is also leading to increased returns year-round. Anyway, typical projects around returns they could involve simply enabling the ease of buy online, return to store, leveraging full screen and touch screen returns processing in that distribution center, even store inventory pullback capabilities, right? Recycling that inventory back to the distribution center based on seasonal changes to a product line. For example, what didn't sell during peak season, you might want to get that back into the DC via a returns process. All right, I know that's quite the list. We should probably move on to the corrective and optimization list. Justin, you want to go through that?
Yeah, so let's go ahead and let's look at this really quickly. And I'm gonna come from a point of experience. So I've seen a lot of focus in the past on pain points around optimization and capacity. If inventory availability issues are a concern, you want to evaluate if you're using all the internal and external inventory sources. Stores and warehouses, those are your internal sources. 3PLs and manufacturers, those are your external sources. If you're using all of them, life becomes a lot easier. If labor availability or capacity is one of your concerns, automation can be used to do more with less people. Look at your business rules. Could they be extended or simplified to minimize the manual entry, maximize compliance? Look at your machinery. Do you have scan, weigh, print, and apply tunnels? Options like the CVP we talked about earlier, picking robots, and others. Do you have that automation, that mechanical automation where you need it? And of course, review your front of line shipment options versus your end of line shipment options. These are things that change a lot.
Hey, Justin, just for my own benefit, could you expand a little bit on how that front of line versus end of line could impact peak season throughput or efficiency?
Yeah, of course. So when we're talking about front of line, this is where you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned waveless picking.
Yeah.
Well, generally, if you're doing wave picking, you may also be doing front of line shipping, okay, where we're producing a shipment label with the pick documents. However, if you're doing waveless picking, or you called it stream picking? Order streaming, there we go. If we're doing order streaming, then odds are you're applying a label after you've actually picked and packed those items. That would be end of line.
Got it. Thank you for that insight. All right, so let's move on to the all-important evaluation task at the end of the strategic planning. So the evaluation involves obviously collecting the effort, scope, and the budget, but the important step of defining the expected results is what's typically sometimes missing, right? I'm talking about operations success metrics. They can be in the terms of dollars, labor, throughput, productivity, fill rate, ship on time, whatever your business cares about. So incorporating those expected results into your evaluation is an important step.
All right. And of course, as we look into prioritize, not all initiatives will be able to be implemented in given off-season. So we want to look at the results of the evaluation steps that Scott just spoke about, and we want to start prioritizing the process. It's up to the business leaders to select the appropriate mix of initiatives that will have the best impact of innovation and stability of the business systems.
So after the prioritization, the leaders must select and commit to the initiatives that are being executed.
Yeah, and we really want to stress, we see a difference between selection and commitment.
Yeah, commitment's the real need here. It's not just the budget, timeline, and resources and business will. Sometimes I see customers not have that last component, the business will, right there, right? This is where I see they stumble and cause delay for themselves. So I would say set yourself a deadline for this commitment, because dragging out the commitment can quickly become a non-commitment. And frankly, a little bit of upward management is sometimes needed here as a leader. Ensure your executive team knows how critical it is to start this process on time.
Yeah, and Scott, we like to say that the lack of timely decision is a commitment to do little or nothing in the off-season. So when do you see most companies need to decide or make a commitment by?
Well, if the list is modest, let's say March is a pretty typical month. If it's major, they may have to begin well before that, right? So it kind of depends, but you can quickly figure out that date by roughly backing in the dates from your peak season validation phase, and which we'll discuss here in a second. So moving on to execution. After we commit, we must execute, and typically this includes configuration, development, testing, and deployment, and that occurs in that roughly that April through August timeframe.
Yeah, and this is where your internal project teams, your external teams, that could include ProShip in Manhattan, so on and so forth, that's where they commence building the solutions with input from the stakeholders and operations. You want to ensure that you have resource availability, but also stakeholder availability. Without that, decisions can't be made. Remember that you have many teams working at the same time: internal, ERP, WMS, hardware vendors, shipping software vendors. Any unexpected results can cascade from one system, causing other systems to make changes to the support and other things in order to ensure that you meet your timelines. Ensure that your conflict resolution processes are excellent.
Yep. And to that point, also, we recommend weeks of contingency into your project plan. Just last year, Justin and I had a customer that was proceeding with a critical needed for peak enhancement, and they had a QA system hardware failure right in the middle of their testing. Now, they were able to swap out that hardware, get it replaced pretty quickly, but they effectively lost 3 or 4 weeks since their testing teams were disrupted. The new environment had some quirks, and they had to work it out. Now, luckily, though, they had built some contingency into the project plan, and they were still able to deploy it before peak season. But had that contingency not been in the plan, they wouldn't have had time to complete other testing. And there's a really good chance the business would not have accepted the risk of deploying an untested major change just before peak. So, just kind of net, their investment for peak would not have provided the benefits last year. Would have had to wait an entire another season. Which actually reminds me of another important point: the need for holistic project management across all these projects and incorporating them into the peak season prep calendar.
Yeah, it's very important to get all that incorporated because peak season isn't moving. As I like to say, there's no ability to move Christmas.
No, it's true. We've tried. It just doesn't work.
All right, let's go ahead and move on to the validation phase. Before you go into UAT with your users, they need to be trained. They need to know what the new features, functionalities that you've worked so hard to deliver over the past 6 months. Now, as you're starting this training process with your permanent workers, now is a great time to prepare this year's temp worker training as well.
Yeah, I really like that idea, that concept of ensuring the training is in place before the testing phase so you can incorporate it. So let's talk about volume performance testing. So it's pretty critical for a few reasons. So if your last peak season was challenging, I'd recommend a VPT. If the volume is increased beyond the original sizing assumptions, or if your processes have changed. You've likely added some local optimizations as part of your peak season prep initiatives. So you'll need to know if the bottleneck or that weakest link has moved, and the VPT will expose that. So VPT is typically performed in a non-production environment where scripting is used to simulate high-volume transactions or processes or interfaces, the areas where we feel are most prone to becoming that bottleneck during peak season. VPT can also include what we call surge testing, basically holding back orders in the systems as far upstream as possible and releasing them. This tests the ability for systems to handle deep queues of transactions. It tests interface loads, etc. Yeah,
and I'd like to point out that from a software standpoint, there's different optimizations that your vendors will put in place for handling doubling over a day, which is just a volume increase, versus doubling or tripling for a few minutes or hours due to holds upstream or surge results. The most impactful failure points are typically around printing in our experience, specifically shipping documentation printing. Right? So let's move on to compression testing. This is the use of artificially holding back live orders to evaluate system readiness.
Yeah, I consider this the most important test of them all because it tests everything. All right, it tests systems, processes, people, and I've seen customers try very different and creative approaches to achieve those bursts of peak season volume in production. Holding and releasing, in other words, compression. But customers also leverage those one-day sales, summer sales, Labor Day sales, etc., to simulate that peak season volume in a short period of time. The key is not only to test the systems, it's to test the DC and store operations processes. Bring in some temporary workers too and test everything that they're typically doing during peak season. If you have any peak season specific processes, those should be included in your compression test as well, such as any value-added services like gift wrap. This also includes testing store systems that would perhaps be processing ship from store orders.
Yeah, and when we look at this deeper, we talked about that front of line versus end of line options that you might have. You need an understanding of the human-machine augmentation options you might have. When you use people, when do you do it through surge, when is automation overloaded, how do you solve these problems? Have you properly prepared this augmentation with failover to manual processes?
Of course, once all the tests are complete, you need to identify, implement any solutions to the problems or optimizations uncovered. And you might even need to have time to conduct a follow-up test. All right, so moving on to the readiness phase. So disaster management and recovery. So as part of this phase, you should be verifying your HA/DR processes. This is about who does what for those processes that are not automatic as well. I too often see customers with DR processes on paper, but they're not really ready to execute them. So I can't stress enough the importance of truly testing a DR process in the readiness phase. And also, it's just not about systems, right? It's the processes you have in place for example, for unforeseen distribution center outages, where you may need to leverage stores. A DC can go down if there's an ice storm, for example, or various reasons. Also, the processes for store outages. How do you quickly redirect orders to ship from other stores efficiently when a store is suddenly available?
Yeah, and let's not forget, you want to have processes for when your carrier networks get overloaded, service level upgrades due to inventory availability or pick delays. As a matter of fact, we had a customer with delayed container shipments from China that required basically a cross-dock process with service level upgrades for all customers who were in zones 3 and above. Well, you have to do this manually, or your enterprise software stack allow you this to occur automatically.
Quite the challenge. All right, so technical audits. I recommend leveraging your systems vendors' technical audit programs. They know what to look out for when they're auditing their own systems for you. So, for example, Manhattan Associates offers a SureCheck technical audit to audit all the systems we recommend from an infrastructure perspective, like database, operating system, Java container, etc. And by leveraging your vendors' audit programs, you can also benefit from the optimizations and learnings that they've found when they work with their other customers. And we also check things like database tuning, maintenance verification, data retention, license key expiration checks, and things like that.
Yeah, so moving on to peak season configuration, we want to make sure that we have all the managers and backup personnel trained on configurable items. We want to validate that these people who are trained, that they're going to be available on all relevant shifts. Doesn't help if you trained everybody and they're all day shift guys. How do you do it at night? You want to make sure that you know how to deal with, from a shipping standpoint, overloaded carrier networks. You want to make sure that you deal with last-minute negotiations that might happen, such as super weekend.
All right, so we're right in the phase right now around the October, November time frame, and we've just wrapped up the readiness phase. So after all these readiness tasks are completed, we of course move into the monitoring and support phase. This is the actual peak season activity.
You know that one of the most important best practices in a peak season prep is to be diligent about gathering and recording the challenges and successes that happen during peak season. Now is the time in this phase to assign a record keeper or record keepers. If you get nothing else from this webinar today, you hope that you at least take a step today to establish this role and a process to capture all the valuable information that occurs during the chaos of peak. In late December, you realize so much has happened since mid-November. You can simply forget it all, right? If you don't record what's going right and wrong with examples, much will be lost before that strategic planning phase.
Yeah, it's so true. It's such an important phase to wrap up. All right, so the next task at hand here is the change control. So all the recommendations from the audits should be implemented by this phase. All the configuration changes, all the new process changes. And now you must establish and act on your freeze dates, meaning lock it all down. All right, this includes freezing code and configuration. And documenting and obtaining internal buy-in on the process for any emergency changes that might be needed.
Scott, lockdown is great, but you want to make sure you don't lock it down too tight. You know there's going to be changes. I've discussed some of them, like carrier network changes, last-minute logistics manager deals, super weekends, things of that nature. So you want to leave the right lockdowns in place to allow these to occur.
Yeah, good point. So another best practice is to maintain a change control log across everything. Right? That's configuration, code, operating system changes, and such that you can reference it if a system incident occurs. Because the first question we ask is, why now? Well, what changed? And a quick reference to a holistic log is critical, and it saves time when frankly time is of the essence. And when you've executed as much proactive preparation as possible, It's time to ensure you have an effective rapid response process in place to handle the inevitable, unforeseen incidents that happen during peak. So Manhattan kind of views this as 3 layers of defense. First is monitoring and alerts. This is building, using and testing all of these alerts also during the compression tests.
Yeah, and during that compression testing is one of those times to look for other things. There's nothing as devastating as an unindexed report on a critical database. We've actually experienced customers in the past where an analyst delayed shipping because of the fact that they pulled a report from a live database without having tested it first. So the lesson learned there is obviously to pull new reports from non-live data sources or after hours, but preferably use that data warehouse to pull those reports.
The second layer of defense here is a well-trained frontline team. They're obviously probably going to have a 24/7 schedule. So we call this more of a level 2 support. This is your experts that are experts on your people that are experts on the key systems. Third would be immediate access to specialty needs, 24/7. Now, these are the folks that you should have on call, like DBAs, system administrators, mechanics. Don't assume people are just going to pick up their cell phone. You need to have an on-call system for all of them. Fourth, while this one's optional, highly recommended, having some dedicated support lined up from your key vendors, such as your MHE providers, Manhattan, and even ProShip.
Yeah, though we're focusing really on Manhattan and ProShip here. Remember that this is for all your critical systems. So your point of sale, your ERPs, your WMSs, your e-com components. These are all part of an enterprise software stack where you're going to want to make sure you have as short a turnaround time as possible.
Sure. Lastly, so Manhattan adds this special 5th layer of defense during peak season. We call them our ready teams. They're small, autonomous SWAT teams with the skills to solve the most complex issues during those critical weeks. It's kind of our secret weapon to rapid response and recovery.
Okay. And now is the time to check with your company and your vendors to see how prepared you as a team are for peak season issues.
All right, so as we wrap up this webinar, I'd like to outline what we consider to be the key takeaways from each of the phases. So first, start early, right? And ensure you have that stakeholder commitment. And of course, leverage Manhattan and ProShip partnerships. We are here to help. Second, include contingency in your plan. Weeks of contingency in your project plan. As we said earlier, the holidays don't move. Third would be test your DR processes. Don't just document them, but make sure you actually test them.
Okay. Number four would be conduct training and compression testing. Compression tests are critical, both within the test systems as well as in production systems when possible. Number 5, assign that record-keeping role. This is all about continuous improvement, and it's hard to improve what you haven't documented. Finally, schedule that post-peak lessons learned meeting as early as you can. As you enter peak, if you can schedule that for early January, that would be the best time.
All right. So before we sign off today, I would like to thank you all for your time. And please feel free to follow up with us directly if you're interested in discussing any of the content in more detail, as Manhattan and ProShip would love to help you with your peak season success.
All right. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. If you do have questions, please send them to peaksuccess@manh.com or sales@proshipinc.com.